3 years after my father told the community I was making a mistake. The same community started coming to me for advice. Not occasionally, regularly. The neighbors who had given me the specific look of people who had been told something concerning. The family friends who had offered unsolicited opinions about stability and risk. The community figures who had asked questions that were shaped by whatever my father had said to them. All of them, now sitting across from me in my office, asking how I had done it, what the approach had been, whether I could look at something they were working on. I helped all of them, without mentioning what the preceding 3 years had contained, without referencing what had been said about me in the rooms where these conversations had started. Just gave them what they came for, and watched the specific, quiet satisfaction of a thing completing its circle. Then one evening my father arrived at the office. Alone, without calling ahead, without a stated reason. He sat down across from me and said 4 words that said everything that needed to be said. I was wrong and I was afraid. That was all. But to understand why 4 words were enough, you need to know what the 3 years had cost. My father was the kind of man communities are built around. Not through official position exactly, though he had held some of those over the years. Through the specific quality of someone whose presence in a room changes the temperature of it, whose opinion, once expressed, tends to become the opinion of the people around him. Not through force, through the accumulated credibility of someone who has been right often enough and present long enough that his judgment carries weight before he has said anything. He had lived in the same community for over 30 years, had built relationships across every layer of it. The neighbors who had known him since we moved in when I was 7, the community organizations he had been involved in, the religious institution where he was respected, the network of family friends that had developed across decades of shared occasions. He knew everyone, and everyone knew him. More importantly, everyone listened to him. That quality had been a source of pride for me growing up, not in a boastful way, in the particular way that children take pride in parents who are respected, who occupy their world with a weight that tells the child something about who they come from, about the kind of person they might become. I had wanted to be like him in that specific way, not identical, but possessed of the same quality, the capacity to occupy a community as someone whose presence means something. My career until my early 30s had been the kind of career that produced no conflict between us. Stable profession, regular income, the particular respectability of someone who had done what was expected and was performing well within the expected parameters. He had spoken of my work with the ease of someone describing something they were comfortable with. The specific pride of a father whose child has made sensible choices. I had been aware that this ease was partly about him, about what my stability said to the community about his parenting, about the particular satisfaction of a man whose son had turned out right. Not cynically aware, just aware. The business idea had been developing for 2 years before I acted on it. A specific gap in the market I had been working in. A solution I could see clearly. The growing certainty that the thing I was building in my head was real enough to be worth attempting. I told my father on a Sunday evening, the natural occasion, the family dinner that was the fixed point of the week. He listened, asked questions, practical ones, about the capital required, the timeline to profitability, the specific risks, all legitimate questions, all carrying a quality underneath them that was not quite neutrality. The quality of someone who is gathering information to support a conclusion they have already reached. At the end of the conversation, he said he thought it was a significant risk, that the stability I had was not something to walk away from lightly, that he hoped I had thought carefully. I told him I had. We left it there. I assumed the conversation would stay between us, that whatever his reservations were, they would be private, that the disagreement between a father and son about a career choice would remain in the space where such disagreements belong, between two people, not in the broader world where his voice carried weight. I assumed incorrectly. The first sign was a neighbor, Mr. Okonkwo from 3 doors down, who had known my family since I was in primary school. who had always been warm with me in the specific way of a community elder who watches children grow into adults with genuine interest. He stopped me on the street about 2 weeks after the dinner, asked how things were going. I said, well. He nodded, then said he had heard I was making some changes, that he hoped I was being careful, that these things could be difficult, that stability was not something to take for granted. He said it with genuine kindness, with the specific warmth of someone who believes they are offering helpful counsel. I thanked him, said I appreciated his concern, and walked home, knowing immediately where the information had come from, and understanding for the first time that the dinner conversation had not stayed in the room where it had happened. The second sign was a family friend at a gathering the following weekend, who took me aside, said she had heard about the business idea, said she wanted me to know that there were other ways to pursue entrepreneurial interests without leaving a stable position entirely. That part-time arrangements existed, but there was no need to risk everything. She said it with the same genuine concern as Mr. Okonkwo, the same framing of helpfulness, the same specific quality of someone who has received information from a source they trust, and who has decided to act on that information by offering their version of wise counsel. I thanked her, said I would think about it, and moved on. By the third occasion, I had understood the pattern completely. My father had been talking, not in the way of someone spreading gossip. He would not have understood it as that. He would have understood it as concern, as the natural sharing of a worry with the people around him whose opinions he valued, whose counsel he was perhaps seeking, whose confirmation of his own misgivings he was perhaps looking for. He was a man who processed things through community, through the network of relationships that had been the fabric of his adult life. And he had processed his concern about my decision through that network, without fully considering what it would mean for me to be the subject of that processing, to walk through my own community as the object of other people's concern, the person about whom something worrying had been said, who was now receiving the downstream effects of conversation he had not been party to. The effects were specific and cumulative, the looks that carried a quality they had not previously carried, not hostile, pitying, the particular pity of people who believe someone is heading toward a difficulty they could have avoided, the unsolicited advice from people whose standing to offer it existed entirely in the fact that my father had spoken to them, the specific weight of moving through a community where you know you have been discussed, and where the discussion has been shaped by someone whose voice carries weight. I did not confront my father. I thought about it, had the conversation in my head several times, each version of it producing outcomes I did not want. A confrontation would have created a public disagreement, would have put him in the position of having to defend something he probably did not fully recognize as wrong, would have made the situation larger rather than smaller, and would have distracted me from the only thing that actually mattered, the work, because the work was the only answer to what had been said about me, not the argument, not the public correction, not the confrontation that invited everyone who had received his concern to reassess based on my response to it. Just the work, done well enough, for long enough, to produce a result that spoke more clearly than any conversation could. I said nothing. To my father, to the neighbors, to the family friends, to anyone who offered their version of cautious counsel. Just thanked them and went back to building, in the specific silence of someone who has decided that their response is going to be visible rather than audible, and who understands that visible responses take time. The first year was the hardest, not because of the work itself, because of what it felt like to be doing the work inside a community that had been given a specific story about what the work would produce. A story of risk and concern and a son making a mistake. That story existed in the air around me everywhere I went in that community. Not spoken constantly, present, in the quality of the interactions, in the questions that carried a subtext, in the particular way people asked how things were going, with an inflection that was not neutral, that was checking in on a situation they understood to be fragile. I navigated it without engaging with it. That required a specific discipline, not of emotion, of response. The discipline of someone who has decided that the narrative being run about them is not their responsibility to correct through argument, that the correction will come through result, and that engaging with the narrative before the result exists is simply noise. I focused on the work, the specific problem I had identified, the solution I was building, the clients I was finding, the operational infrastructure I was constructing piece by piece, all of it requiring the full attention I had available, which was more available because I had decided not to spend any of it on the community story. My father and I maintained a surface. The Sunday dinners continued. Occasional contact through the week. The functional relationship of a family that is navigating a disagreement without naming it directly. He did not ask about the business in the way that would have required me to tell him how it was going. He asked in the way that suggested he already knew how he expected it to be going, which was not well. The questions carried the specific quality of someone who is waiting for confirmation they have already anticipated. I gave him updates that were accurate, not embellished, not shaped to produce a particular impression, just accurate, and watched him receive them with the polite reservation of someone who is withholding judgment, while already having judged. The community's version of the story began to change in the second year. Not dramatically, gradually. The way the story changes when the evidence starts accumulating in a direction the story hadn't predicted. The business had clients, real ones, whose satisfaction was visible, who mentioned it to people, the way satisfied clients mention things to people, without being asked, as the natural expression of something that has worked well. Those mentions moved through the same network my father had used to distribute his concern, the community network. The web of relationships that connects everyone to everyone. Information moving through it in the same way information always moves through a close community, through the ordinary channels of people talking to each other. The difference was that now the information being distributed was different. Not concern, evidence. The business was producing results, was being spoken about, was becoming something that people in the community had heard good things about. Not yet a success story in the full sense, but no longer the risk that had been described. Something real and growing. I noticed the change in the interactions, the specific quality of them shifting, the pity that had colored the early questions giving way to something else. A recalibration, the particular adjustment that happens when people who had formed a view are presented with evidence that complicates the view. Some of them adjusted quickly. Said they had always thought it was a good idea, in the specific way that people revise their expressed positions when the outcomes become clear. Others adjusted more slowly, with the particular difficulty of those whose caution had been most visibly expressed, who had offered the most confident counsel, and who were now sitting with the specific discomfort of advice that had not aged well. I watched all of it, without drawing attention to it, without the particular satisfaction that pointing at it would have produced. Just noted it, and kept working, because the third year was where the thing I had been building became visible as what it actually was. Not a risk that had worked out, something genuinely worth noticing. And the community noticed, in the specific way communities notice when something in their midst has become a success story, with a particular warmth that people extend to things they feel connected to, even when the connection had not always expressed itself as support. Mr. Okonkwo was the first, which felt appropriate, given that he had been the first to stop me on the street with the concern my father had distributed. He came to the office, not casually, with a specific request. His son was thinking about starting something, a small business, adjacent to what I had built. He wanted to know if I would be willing to speak with him, to share some of what I had learned. He said it with the specific warmth that had always characterized him. But the quality of the warmth was different from the version on the street 3 years earlier. That it had been the warmth of someone dispensing concern to a younger person they were slightly sorry for. Now, it was the warmth of someone approaching someone they respected, whose standing in the exchange had shifted. I said yes, met with the son, gave him an honest account of what building something from nothing actually required. Not the polished version, the real one, with the difficulty intact. The son appreciated it. The meetings that followed came through the same network. The family friend who had suggested part-time arrangements arrived one afternoon. Her daughter was at a career crossroads, was considering leaving a stable position, was afraid. She wanted to know if I would talk to her. I met with the daughter, told her what I thought. Without performing certainty about outcomes, I couldn't guarantee. Just the honest account of someone who had made the decision and had lived through what followed. The daughter found it useful, said so directly. The family friend called me afterward, said she was glad her daughter had spoken to me, said nothing that referenced the conversation 3 years earlier. I said nothing that referenced it either. The community figures who had asked the pointed questions began appearing in different ways. For their own businesses, for their children, for organizations they were part of. All of them arriving with the specific posture of people who have recognized that the landscape has changed, and who are navigating the change without explicitly acknowledging what preceded it. I helped all of them, without exception, not because I had no memory of what the 3 years had contained, because the help was genuine, was the thing I had to offer. And offering it was more useful than withholding it would have been, more aligned with the kind of person I wanted to be in that community. The person whose success had produced generosity, not the person whose success had produced the specific pleasure of watching those who had doubted him come to need him. Those are different people, and I had decided which one I was going to be. My father observed all of this from the position he occupied in the same community, which meant he heard about it. In the same way he had heard about everything for 30 years. Through the network, through the people who spoke to him about what they saw. He would have heard my name mentioned differently than it had been mentioned 3 years earlier. Not the subject of concern, the source of something useful, the person people were going to, the person people were recommending, the person whose presence in the community had acquired the specific weight that his had always carried. I did not know exactly what he was hearing, or how he was processing it. We maintained the surface, the Sunday dinners, the functional contact, the particular navigation of a relationship that had something unspoken in it, something that had been unspoken for 3 years, sitting between us at every occasion, acknowledged by neither, present regardless. Then one Tuesday evening, not a Sunday, not a scheduled occasion, his car appeared outside my office. I saw it from the window before he came in, sat for a moment, knowing something significant was about to arrive, in the form of a man who had been a respected figure in our community for 30 years. Walking into the office his son had built, while the community that had received his concern was coming to that son for advice. He knocked. I said to come in. He sat down and said nothing for a moment, just sat. The particular stillness of someone who has come with something to say, and who is finding the beginning of it. He looked around the office first, not quickly, with the specific attention of someone seeing something properly for the first time. The space I had built, the visible evidence of 3 years of work, the particular quality of a place that has been occupied purposefully, that carries the texture of something real. He looked at it the way you look at something that contains more than you expected, that exceeds the picture you had been carrying. Then he looked at me. I waited. He said he had been driving past for a few weeks, had not stopped, had driven past, and continued 3 or 4 times before he came in tonight. I said nothing, not to make it harder for him, because nothing needed to be said yet. He said he had heard a great deal in recent months about what I had built, about the people who were coming here, about how those conversations had gone. He named Mr. Okonkwo, the family friend, 2 of the community figures, said he had heard from each of them, in the natural way of a man at the center of a community network through which information moves continuously. He said hearing it had produced something he had not anticipated. Not pride exactly, not yet, something more uncomfortable than pride. The specific feeling of someone who is presented with evidence that their judgment was wrong, and who is sitting with the full weight of what that wrongness had meant. Not just the judgment itself, what he had done with the judgment. He said he knew he had talked, said it plainly, without the softening language that people use when they are acknowledging something they're not comfortable acknowledging. He said he had told people, had framed it as concern, had believed at the time that it was concern, but that looking at it honestly now, he could see it had been something else alongside the concern. Embarrassment. The word landed in the room between us. He said it with the specific difficulty of a proud man naming something unflattering about himself. He said he'd been embarrassed, that the decision I had made had reflected on him in his own mind, on the version of himself he occupied in that community, the father whose son had made a sensible choice, who had turned out right. My leaving the stable position had disrupted that version, had introduced an uncertainty about the outcome, an uncertainty that his standing in the community had felt attached to. And he had managed that uncertainty by distributing it, by making it a shared concern rather than a private one, by getting the community involved in the anxiety he was feeling, without considering that the community's involvement would land on me, would follow me through every interaction, would color every exchange I had for 3 years. He said he had not thought about that part, had thought about his own concern, had not thought about what it meant for me to be the object of other people's concern, to walk through a place I had grown up in, where everyone knew my name and my family, under the specific shadow of a story he had started. I listened to all of it, not with the satisfaction I might have expected, not with the relief of a long-awaited acknowledgement finally arriving, with something more complicated, the specific feeling of hearing a version of events that you already understood, but that lands differently when the person at the center of it is saying it themselves, when the account comes from inside, rather than from your own interpretation. He said the 4 words at the end, I was wrong and I was afraid. Brief, without embellishment, without the extended apology that performs remorse rather than expressing it. Just the core of it, placed in the room, and left there. I sat with it for a moment. Then I said something I had not planned to say. I told him that what he had described, the embarrassment, the investment of his standing in my outcome, I understood it, not as an excuse, as something true about who he was, about the specific form his parenting had taken. How much of it had been about the version of himself that my choices reflected back to him, and how that had made his concern less about me and more about the picture of himself he needed to maintain. I told him I had known that, had understood it even at the time, had been angry about it without being able to separate the genuine concern from the thing underneath it. He listened to that without defending himself. The particular quality of someone receiving something true about themselves and letting it be received, without the immediate movement toward justification. We sat in the office for about an hour, talking more honestly than we had talked in 3 years. Perhaps more honestly than we had talked in longer than that, about what he had needed me to be, and what I had needed to be instead, about the specific distance between those two things, and what that distance had cost both of us. The conversation was not a resolution, not the clean conclusion of a story that has been building for years. It was a beginning of something more honest, the particular beginning that is only possible when the thing that has been unspoken is finally spoken, by the person who most needed to speak it. He came back the following week, not with something specific to say, just to be in the space, to see what I had built in the ordinary way of someone who is allowing themselves to see something they had been avoiding seeing. He walked around, asked questions about the work, specific questions, the kind that told me he had been thinking about it since the previous visit, that he had gone home and processed what he had heard and had come back to understand more. I answered everything he asked, without performing the answer, without shaping it to produce a particular impression. Just told him what the work was and what it had required and what it had produced. He listened with the specific quality of attention that I had always associated with him, that had always been one of the things I respected most. The genuine interest in understanding something properly, applied now to something he had spent 3 years keeping at a distance. Because keeping at a distance had been easier than understanding it. The visits became a pattern, not weekly, but regular. The particular rhythm of a relationship finding a new way to exist. Not the relationship we had before the business decision. Not a restoration of something that had been interrupted. Something different, more honest, built on the understanding that had been absent before. On both sides, he began speaking differently about the business in the community. I know this because the community told me, in the specific way that a community reports back to someone when the story about them has changed. Not with drama. In passing, mentions that told me what was being said in the rooms where I was not present. His name attached to mine now in a different way. Not the concern, the pride, properly arrived at, through the particular process of a man who had been wrong and had said so, and had then adjusted, not for the community's benefit, because the adjustment was real. The community noticed the adjustment the way communities notice everything, and reflected it back to me the way communities reflect everything. I want to describe something about the 3 years, and what they had produced beyond the business. Because the business was the visible part, the part that could be pointed at, the evidence that accumulated into a result. But there was something less visible that had also been produced, something I had built in myself across 3 years of doing the work under a specific kind of pressure. Not just the pressure of building something from nothing, the pressure of building it inside a community that had been told to expect failure. That specific pressure had produced something, a quality of certainty about the work that did not depend on external validation, that had been tested and had held. Not because I had been indifferent to what people thought, because I had been indifferent to whether what they thought was going to change what I did. Those are different things. I care what people thought. I had simply decided it wasn't a reason to do anything differently. That distinction had produced a person who was more settled in their own judgment than the person who had walked into the community as the subject of his father's concern. More certain of their own assessment. More comfortable with being misread, with being ahead of the story that others were telling about them. My father had produced that quality, inadvertently, through the specific pressure of his disappointment distributed across a community, which is the particular irony of the whole experience. That the thing most designed to make the work difficult had also made the person doing it stronger. I thought about that sometimes, in the way you think about things that have multiple truths in them simultaneously. He had been wrong, and he had been afraid. He had also produced something in me that the easier version of events would not have produced. I don't offer that as a justification. It is just true, and true things with multiple layers are worth sitting with. The community that had received his concern became the community that received the result. The same people, the same network, the same relationships through which information travels. All of it now carrying a different story. Not the story of a son making a mistake. The story of a son who had built something. While the story was that he was making a mistake, which is its own kind of story. One that communities remember in a specific way. Not as a triumph exactly. As a reference point, the thing they come back to when they talk about what is possible. When someone else in the community stands at the edge of a decision that looks like risk. My father is still a respected figure in that community. Still the man whose opinion carries weight. Still the person at the center of the network. But what he says about risk is different now. What he says about his children is different now. The specific thing he communicates when someone tells him their son or daughter is leaving a stable position to build something is different. I have heard it reported back to me, through the community, through the channels that carry everything. He tells them that his son did that it was not easy, that there was a period where he didn't understand it, where he had not been as supportive as he should have been, and that what his son built was worth what it cost. He says it without self-congratulation. Without making himself the protagonist of the story, he was not the protagonist of. Just the honest account of a man who has watched something happen and has updated his understanding of what is possible. The Sunday dinners continue. The fixed point they have always been. But the texture of them is different. The specific ease that exists between two people who have said the true thing, and who no longer need to navigate around the unspoken version of it. He asks about the work. Genuinely. I answer genuinely, and sometimes he asks questions that tell me he has been thinking about it between the asking, that he is engaged now in the way he had not been able to be engaged before, when the engagement would have required him to reconcile the work with the story he had been telling about it. That reconciliation has happened, slowly, without announcement, over the cups of tea and the Sunday meals and the Tuesday evening visits and the honest conversation that had started everything. I was wrong and I was afraid. For words that had said what 3 years of silence had not been able to say, and that had changed the basis of everything that followed. Not perfectly, not completely, in a way that honest things change the basis of relationships, by removing the thing that had been requiring management and letting what was actually there be what it was. Sometimes the people who doubt you loudest are the ones most afraid of what it means if you succeed. And sometimes success is the only language they understand. If this story resonated with you, the silence, the building, the 4 words that finally arrived, leave in the comments. I read every one, and the next story is already waiting for you.